The morning started like every other morning during her training, except this time she didn't get up. She had been running for 23 straight days, building a rhythm that felt automatic and certain. But on the 24th morning, the alarm found her so deeply asleep that the decision to stay in bed felt almost physical. By the end of the week, the running shoes sat untouched in the corner, and the habit felt as distant as something that had never been real. Something collapsed in that one skipped day, and the collapse seemed to erase everything that had come before it. The sudden loss of forward motion puzzled her as much as it disappointed her. Momentum is a word we borrow from physics, but in human behavior, it describes something more fragile than a rolling stone. Psychological momentum feels like a force that builds through consistency and can shatter at the first interruption. The easy answer is that she lost motivation, that her willpower simply ran out at the wrong moment. But that explanation stops too soon, because the same person who was fully committed on Wednesday became entirely disconnected by Friday. What can turn one skipped morning into a vanishing habit? And why does a streak sometimes feel harder to restart than to begin? Psychologists who study goal pursuit have noticed that a single lapse does not destroy progress, but the meaning we give the lapse often does. When people believe that a streak must be perfect to count, a single missed day registers as a total failure. That mental shift has a name researchers use: the abstinence violation effect. Addiction researchers first observed that a small slip, one drink during sobriety, could spiral into a full relapse because the person felt the whole attempt was already ruined. The same all-or-nothing thinking appears in everyday habits long before anything clinical is at stake. After skipping one run, a person looks at a scoreboard that flipped from unbroken to broken and feels as if the entire investment has been wiped out. The mind treats the streak like a fragile glass object rather than a flexible practice that can bend and return. This is not simply weakness or laziness. It is a predictable cognitive pattern that pulls toward giving up rather than continuing. Dieting researchers gave it a blunter name: the what the hell effect. In one classic demonstration, dieters who believed they had already exceeded their daily calorie limit responded by eating significantly more afterward. They did not compensate by eating less later. Instead, they behaved as if the entire day were a dietary write-off. The feeling of having already failed gave them permission to abandon the goal. And the same permission structure operates on a missed workout or a skipped practice session. What makes the what the hell effect so dangerous to momentum is that it turns a small interruption into an identity verdict. The runner who skips one day is no longer simply a runner who took a rest day. In her own mind, she has become someone who stopped. And when the label changes, the behavior follows because we tend to act in ways that match the story we are telling ourselves. The identity piece is critical. Before the skip, she saw herself as a person who runs every day, which made the next run feel natural. After the skip, that self-definition blurs, and the decision to run again suddenly requires a deliberate act of self-repair rather than a simple continuation. The missed morning therefore begins a quiet renegotiation. Am I still the type of person who does this? Or have I broken the chain that held that identity together? This renegotiation explains why restarting can feel heavier than starting fresh, even though the body has not lost any meaningful fitness in a few days. The heaviness is not physical exhaustion. It is the cognitive load of To understand why that load can be so paralyzing, it helps to look at how habits become automatic in the first place. A habit is not a guarantee. It is a learned connection between a cue, a routine, and a reward that strengthens through repetition. After several weeks of consistent morning runs, the sight of the running shoes by the door or the feel of the early light became cues that triggered the run with very little deliberate thought. But that automaticity depends partly on the predictability of the sequence, and a skipped day disrupts the predictability before anything else changes. That signal can feel like uncertainty about whether the habit still works, and uncertainty is one of the fastest drains on motivation. So the morning after the skip, there is no longer a pure automatic pull toward the shoes. There is instead a pause filled with questions that were not present the day before. Will it feel too hard? Have I lost the rhythm completely? Does this mean I'm not really a consistent person? These questions do not arise because the runner is weak. They arise because the interruption has temporarily dismantled the efficiency that made the streak feel effortless. Now compare two people after the same skipped day. One interprets the gap as a temporary bump and laces up without a self-judgment crisis. The other interprets the gap as evidence that the whole project is collapsing and skips the next day to avoid facing the meaning of the skip. The behavioral divergence is not random. It is predicted in large part by how each person explains the lapse to themselves. Psychologists call these explanations attributions, and they become especially powerful right after a failure. Someone who attributes it to a temporary external cause, my body needed extra rest that morning, is far more likely to resume without a sense of permanent defeat. The story we craft in the quiet minutes after a slip is therefore one of the most important inputs into whether momentum survives. A single skipped run is almost never pure laziness, nor is it an irreversible verdict on character. Yet the mind under pressure reaches for the harsher explanation first. That harshness has a cost beyond the lost day. It can trigger an avoidance cycle in which the thought of running becomes linked to feelings of shame and failure. And once the activity itself is associated with emotional pain, the brain begins to protect itself by steering attention away from anything that reminds it of the goal. This is how a person who was once excited about a new habit can start to glance away from their running shoes, as if the shoes hold an accusation. The avoidance does not mean the goal is no longer desired. It means the emotional feedback loop around the goal has become punishing rather than rewarding. Importantly, this loop can begin from the smallest interruption, which is what makes momentum loss feel so disproportionate to the size of the original slip. The interruption itself is tiny. The emotional structure built around it can become enormous. And most of that structure lives in the meaning we assign, not in the muscles or the calendar. Cultural messages that celebrate uninterrupted streaks amplify the fragility because they teach that a streak is only valuable if it remains completely unbroken. Under that logic, a 40-day streak that contains one blank day in the middle is somehow worth less than a 5-day streak without a gap, even though far more work was done. This is irrational, but it is also deeply human because our minds are built to track patterns and count breaks more vividly than they count continuations. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that breaks in routine once signaled dangerous disruptions in the environment, which may be why a skipped pattern feels so disproportionately alarming. The runner, now several days removed from her last run, is not confronting a failure of ability. She is confronting a failure of interpretation. The body still remembers how to run. The habit pathways are still present in the brain. And the physiological adaptation from 3 weeks of training has not evaporated. What has evaporated is the feeling of being a consistent runner. And in the absence of that feeling, every step toward the shoes requires a conscious wrestle that was not required before. But here lies the central psychological reversal. The feeling of momentum never came from perfection. It came from the belief that the sequence would continue. And that belief can be restored by a single resumption even more powerfully than it was damaged by a single interruption. In other words, momentum is not a fragile streak that shatters at the first crack. It is a resilient expectation that can survive gaps if the gaps are defined as ordinary pauses rather than failures. Researchers who study habit formation have found that missing one day does not meaningfully erase the automaticity of a well-established routine. The cue-response connection remains, and most people who resume after a brief lapse find that the habit returns faster than they feared, because the underlying learning is still intact. The real obstacle, therefore, is not the one-day gap. It is the belief that the gap defines the entire effort. This is the hidden turning point in any long pursuit, the moment when the first interruption occurs, and the mind must decide whether the project is finished or just interrupted. The strongest momentum is not the one that never stops. It is the one that knows how to resume. Return to the morning after the missed run, when the shoes are still sitting exactly where they were left the day before the skip. The woman who overslept now faces a choice that is not really about willpower, but about which story she will tell herself about yesterday. Will yesterday be the end of a perfect streak, or will it be a single rest day inside a continuing commitment? The answer determines whether she runs today, and it determines whether the habit will still be there next month. The most dangerous moment in any streak is not the obstacle itself. It is the split second after the first slip, when the mind asks whether the whole journey has just been canceled. If that question is met with a catastrophic yes, then the collapse that follows is not caused by the slip, but by the verdict that followed it. The slip becomes a full stop only when the person treats it as the end of the story, and that treatment is always a choice, even when it does not feel like one at all. This is why the psychology behind losing momentum is not about energy or motivation. It is about the meaning-making machinery that turns a single blank morning into a permanent conclusion. Understanding this does not make the missed run feel good, but it does make the next decision visible as a decision rather than an inevitability. She can put the shoes on today, not to prove that she is perfect, but to prove that she can include imperfection in a practice that is still alive. And when she does, the spell of the broken streak begins to dissolve, because a resumed streak is no longer defined by its uninterruptedness, but by its resilience. The collapse that seemed physical and inevitable at the start of the week is revealed to have been a very powerful story that needed only one contrary action to begin rewriting itself. None of this means that resuming is easy when shame has already settled into the space where the habit used to live. It does mean that the difficulty is located in the interpretation, not in the wreckage of a permanently broken system. And that shift in location is practical, because interpretations can be noticed, questioned, and gradually updated, even when they feel completely true in the moment. One of the simplest evidence-backed strategies is to set a personal rule of never missing twice. A single gap does not reset the identity, but two in a row can harden the new story of having stopped. So the immediate priority after one skip is to close the gap before it widens. This does not require a heroic return. It can be a shorter run, a gentler version, or even putting on the running clothes and stepping outside for 5 minutes. The goal in that delicate window is not performance. It is reconnecting the cue and the action so the habit pathway can reassert itself. Look again at the shoes that had gathered dust in the corner at the end of the week of collapse. They are not a marker of failure. They are a neutral object that waited without judgment while a mental storm passed through. When she finally picks them up, she is not starting over from scratch, because her body, her learning, and her capacity did not reset to zero. She is resuming, which is a fundamentally different act than beginning, and it draws on strengths that beginners do not yet have. The real question that decides whether momentum endures is not whether a person will ever stumble. It is what they will tell themselves the moment they notice they have stumbled. And the most reliable momentum is the kind that is not afraid of the pause, because it knows the pause is part of the path and not the cancellation of it.